Um, I'm delighted that tonight Jacob is going to be talking to us about ants. I think there was something I saw last year in one of the magazines, I think, talking about the number of ants that there are, and it's a very big number. They'd estimated, I think, 20 quadrillion ants. Not quite sure how they counted them, but they estimated 20 quadrillion, which is 20 times 10 to the 15. Now, I think last year also the human population went through 8 billion. So that works out, I think, at 2.5 million ants for every man, woman, and child on this planet. So there's a lot of them. So I'm particularly interested to hear what Jacob's going to be talking about tonight. He did say that he'd make recognizing that many of us are beekeepers, he would reference that sort of aspect as we go along. So it should be good. Please use the chat function on your screens to ask questions, and we'll do those at the end. So I think without any more ado, over to you, Jacob.
Thank you very much, Bob. Yes, so as Bob mentioned, I'm going to talk a bit about ants and the wood ants that I work on, plantation forests, and how they interact with each other. And I'm hoping by the end of this, I'll have given you a bit of an idea of why we study ants, why they're important, a bit of a background in ant biology. I'm aware you're all beekeepers, so you're probably quite familiar with some of the similarities as them also being Hymenoptera. And also talk more specifically about my study species, which is wood ants, and what makes them special. And I'm going to talk a bit about some of the work that I've done with them over the last couple of years, and some of the stuff that I'm writing up now, and yes, working my way through the long drawn out process of publication. But first of all, about the importance of ants, you preempted my fact slightly, Bob, because yeah, one of the main things to consider when you're thinking about the effects that organisms are going to have on the environment is, if they're having a big effect, but there's only 9 of them, like white rhino or something like that, then actually that's going to be a very limited scope. But if you consider ants, they're very, very ubiquitous. They're found all over the place, and they are incredibly numerous. So the estimate of the abundance of ants that stood for many years was by the very famous E.O. Wilson, and he estimated there was somewhere between 1 and 10 quadrillion ants, which is a 1 and 16 zeros after it's the 10 quadrillion is, which is a lot. But this estimate was actually based on essentially observing the ant densities in, I think it was a small area in the south of England, I'm not sure exactly where, and extrapolating it across the Earth's surface, which is which has some merits as taking a sort of mean area and extrapolating it, but obviously the south of England is not necessarily representative of the whole globe. And the more recent estimate that put it at 20 quadrillion actually took into account different areas and different habitats and how the density sort of changes with regard to that. So this is considered a conservative estimate, in fact, because it doesn't include any arboreal ants. So we're used to thinking of ants as nesting in the soil, but in fact, in tropical areas where there's, it's such a high energy environment, there's lots going on, you have huge diversity of ants that are living entirely in the canopy, and they'll spend their whole lives up there, apart from to fly off and mate, for example. And some of these actually have mutualisms with the trees, and they are notoriously difficult to study because in tropical forests, they're sort of 30, 40, even maybe 80 meters up, and getting an accurate appraisal of their density, their abundance there is an impossible task. However, they attempted to do this with all the terrestrial ants, at least. So this 20 quadrillion is just for terrestrial ants. And they estimated that in terms of biomass, that represented about 20% of the biomass of humans. And we all know the effect that that humans can have on the environment and on the world around them. So if we consider that, if you got all the humans and weighed them, you'd have basically a fifth of that weight is in ants in the world. There's the potential for a lot of effect that's going to be quite wide-reaching there. They also monopolize a huge amount of Earth's resources in terms of sort of food and nesting materials. And it's estimated they monopolize about 15 to 20% of terrestrial biomass in some ecosystems. They're especially abundant in the tropics, but even in temperate ecosystems, as you'll see, they can reach really high densities and they can have really big effects. They have a nearly global range. Like everything, or like almost everything, apart from a couple of species of flies and fur seals, they are absent from Antarctica, but they have managed to colonize every other continent on Earth quite extensively. And there's very few ecosystems that don't have some diversity of ants at all. And there's a huge list of potential impacts that they can have. There's been a lot of work recently, and I mean in the sort of last 40 years or so, studying ecosystem services of ants. And I imagine as beekeepers thinking about pollination, you're used to thinking of ecosystem services as pollination is one of the major ecosystem services that bees provide. But there are other things as well, like regulating the cycling of nutrients and controlling pests and that kind of thing. And these are basically ways in which an organism benefits an ecosystem, either from the point of view of humans, so how we utilize that ecosystem, so they might increase the growth of something or they might decrease the abundance of pests, or in terms of benefiting the ecosystem for biodiversity, for example. And this graph here shows the number of publications that studied ant-mediated ecosystem services. And they split it into 4 categories here. We've got provisioning, so supplying of resources. That's usually they're providing food for birds or even humans. They can be cultural, so how does human culture interact with the ants? And then studies that were particularly abundant were regulating and supporting, so where they're either suppressing, one group of organisms by eating them, which means that they don't overwhelm something and disrupt the whole ecosystem, or regulating the cycling of nutrients, for example. And there was a real interest in this that began in the sort of 1980s, and it's just exploded since then. And it does seem that the more we study ants, the more they seem to do. Nobody's ran out of things that can be attributed to ants yet, and not for the want of trying, as you can see. I mean, it's sort of 160 publications in the most recent period, which was 2005 to 2011, and that's just on one very small aspect of ant biology. So there really is there really are a lot of people out there trying to find out the effects that ants can have. And these effects are quite diverse. So their interactions with other organisms, like plants. Here we've got our leafcutter ants, and here we have aphids, from which this ant is taking honeydew, which is a source of carbohydrate for them. Their interactions with other organisms can cause them to have impacts on nutrient cycling, for example. All of this leaf matter that the leafcutter ants are carrying is being input directly into the soil. It's bypassing all of those steps that it would normally take of being on the tree, wilting, and then decaying or being eaten by another herbivore that then digests it and leaves it on the forest floor to decompose. So it's essentially removing these things from the system. And it's not a negligible amount of plant matter. It's estimated that a single leafcutter ant colony of sort of average size is consuming as much leaf material in a day as a large cow would. Don't ask me how they actually discovered this, but this is an estimate that was made at one point in one paper based on the sort of biomass. And so this is really a large impact. If any of you have ever been to the tropics and walked in the forest, you'll know that leafcutter ants are phenomenally abundant. There's almost no part of a forest, if you go on a walk, where you don't see 4 or 5 leafcutter ants nests there. And that's just one species, and their diversity is so great in the tropics. I mentioned as well this harvesting of honeydew. This also represents an input of carbon into the soil. But I think one of the more important things that this is doing is actually depriving the resources from other animals, other organisms. So without the wood ants harvesting this honeydew, which is a byproduct of the aphids sucking sap from the stems of plants, this would simply fall through and not exactly go to waste, but it would be stimulating microbial metabolism. So bacteria would eat it or other organisms. And so in this way, they're sort of regulating the abundance of this in the ecosystem. So you don't get huge spikes of a certain resource. Because if you have an outbreak of a pest like aphids, and there's no ants there to manage the outbreak, either by eating the pests or by feeding on the honeydew, then suddenly you've got this huge impact on the amount of resources available. They can also be pretty voracious predators as well. You see this image on the bottom left here. I believe these are meat ants that they're tearing apart this poor locust. But locusts are, of course, also common pest species in a lot of parts of the world. And their removal, the way they interact with the ecosystem can partly be due to their removal of other organisms from it. Army ants have to basically go on raids in a spiral clockwise, sort of around their bivouac when they're sort of in their sedentary phase. They're quite nomadic because they just exploit all of the resources in the forest and have to move on because there's no insects and small vertebrates that they can eat left in that area. They're an extreme example. Their colonies can be, a couple of million strong, and they are particularly sort of energy demanding. A slightly more peaceful example of an ant-ecosystem service is dispersing seeds, as we can see these harvester ants in the center here. They'll bring seeds to their nest, and some of them will germinate. So they're not actually eating the seeds in many cases, although some of them do. Sometimes they do, but there are many plants that have discovered that ants are a really good way of getting their seeds somewhere underground, protected from seed predators like birds, and in a nice controlled environment where it's not too hot, not too cold, not too moist, not too dry. And they've actually evolved these things called eliosomes, which are little sort of nuggets of nutrition on the end of the seeds, which is what the ants are after. They will find this, they will take them back to the nest. They make them very hard to remove from the seed, so they have to bring the whole seed back to the nest. They eat the eliosome, which is packed with protein, which is really useful for their brood, and then the seed can germinate from the nest. So this is an example of plants actually exploiting the ants for their own dispersal. In addition to this, they can also be pollinators, not nearly as effective as bees, of course, because all the workers are flightless. But nonetheless, there are some species of plant that are almost exclusively pollinated by ants, and they can act as pollinators even for sort of generalist species in certain ecosystems. Though it is, of course, less abundant, less of a service that they provide than compared to, say, flying insects like bees. Since I've mentioned bees, I'll give you an idea of where the ants sit within the Hymenoptera. They are, of course, Hymenoptera, which is presumably why I was invited here to talk about ants to the Beekeepers Association. And they have a very similar life cycle to bees. So the queen will fly off and mate, and then she will find an area to start a new nest, and then she will remain in that nest, laying brood and raising offspring for the rest of her life, potentially. And the workers will help rear those brood. However, there are some differences in their life cycle with bees, which I'll come on to later when I'm talking about the wood ants. But an important point to make here is they are exclusively eusocial. Whereas there are examples of solitary bees, there are examples of solitary wasps, and sawflies are pretty much exclusively solitary. They're the Hymenoptera that nobody ever talks about, sadly. All ants are social to some degree or another, or in fact eusocial to some degree or another. There are sort of different tiers of eusociality. You get really complex super colonies, but you can also have sort of a single queen and a small number of workers in some of the smaller species as well. Now, if any of you have heard of the velvet ant, you might think I'm talking nonsense here, because the velvet ant is solitary. But this doesn't actually break the rule. The velvet ant is in fact a kind of wasp. It's not an ant at all. It's just a wasp that's evolved to lose its wings and live solitarily on the ground. But the resemblance to wasps is not a coincidence. Ants are entirely, well, they are essentially a group of wasps. Their last common ancestor was a wasp, and they are more closely related to some wasps than some wasps are to other wasps, if that makes sense. And they evolved from vespervoid wasps in the Cretaceous period. So it was quite an old split, it's quite an ancient split. But for context, the Cretaceous was about when flowering plants came around. So they are part of this massive insect diversification that occurred towards the end of the Mesozoic. Yeah, and as a result of this, there are plenty of similarities with wasps, which has led some, mostly wasp scientists, to dismiss them as just bloody funny wasps that do strange things, because they are, as I said, entirely nested within wasps as a clade. But there are other similarities with the Hymenoptera. Their system of sex determination is identical to all the other Hymenoptera. As beekeepers, you may well be familiar with this. This example is actually from a paper about bees. But essentially the males of all Hymenoptera or there are some exceptions to that. Occasionally you'll get diploid males in ant colonies, but they are entirely detrimental to the colony. They're sort of a genetic accident, really, that occasionally happens when you're producing hundreds of millions of offspring. Sometimes you get all manner of sort of diversity of outcomes. But for the most part, in 99.99% of cases, males come from an unfertilized egg. Now, because chromosomes are paired and we get one chromosome from our mother and one chromosome from our father of each pair, this means that the males of Hymenoptera are what we call haploid. They only have one of each chromosome, which means there's no chance for the mixing up of the chromosomes in the male. So all of their sperm are genetically identical. And this has a really interesting consequence for the females in Hymenoptera, because it means because the paternal half of their DNA is genetically identical if they have the same father, which they will in colonies, then, or if just with their sisters, for example, they are 75% related to their own sisters, as opposed to 50% related to their siblings, as we would be. Which means they're actually more related to their sisters than they are to their own offspring. So it's much better from the point of view of a female Hymenoptera to help your mother raise more sisters than it is to bother having children yourself. It'll help propagate your genes faster, which is how evolution works. And this is the reason why eusociality has arisen so many times in the Hymenoptera. I mentioned that the last common ancestor of ants was eusocial, but there's been at least a few, three or so, I'm not sure. It always changes around because they change the phylogenies of them when they discover new molecular data, but at least 3 different origins of eusociality in wasps alone. It's this sort of shared system of sex determination that really makes eusociality so prevalent in this group. So that's a bit of background to ants more generally, but I'm going to focus the rest of the talk on the species that I work with, or the group of species I work with, which are these lovely girls, the wood ants. This is Formica lugubris up here, which is the northern hairy wood ant, which is the species I've been working on mostly in the North York moors. And wood ants are generally considered to belong to the Formica rufa group. That's the sort of umbrella term we'd use for all of them. Formica rufa is a species of wood ant we actually have in this country. It's called the southern wood ant or the red wood ant, depending on where you are. And this is sort of the type species for this group of ants. But they all share a lot of traits in common. There's a number of different species, but they all live in forests. They all have very similar nests and so on. And they're all very closely related. They're found throughout northern, boreal and temperate areas. So they've got a circumpolar distribution all through the Siberia, Fennoscandia, North Canada and the Americas, North America, and of course Northern Europe as well, Britain, France, and so on. So they are very, very widely distributed. But the species that we get here are the hairy wood ants, the Formica lugubris, the one I mostly work on, Formica rufa, which I mentioned before, which is the group that the species that the group's named after, and Formica aquilonia, which is known as the Scottish wood ant, because it's mostly found in the north of England. Oh, sorry, in the north in the United Kingdom. But it is in fact found elsewhere in Europe. So that's a very sort of Anglo-centric name for them. But yes, I wouldn't call it that in the continent. But all of them, as I said, are forest specialists, as the name would suggest. And they're also unified by their relationship with aphids. So they have a mutualistic relationship with aphids. You can see this, I think it's a bit of hogweed here, is absolutely black with aphids here. And you can see all of the individual workers of this Formica lugubris here feeding on the honeydew. And some of it they'll eat for themselves, some of it they will take, or most of it, in fact, they'll take back to their nest to feed to their nestmates. And this, as I mentioned, this honeydew is a byproduct of the aphids sucking sap. And this helps us to understand why they're associated with forests and why we find them in the trees. Because there's a huge amount, quite a high abundance of aphids and sap-sucking insects like scale insects and things in the canopies of trees. And so this is why they have such a close relationship with the trees, because it's their main source of carbohydrate for the adults. the young brood require protein from other insects, but the adults will feed almost exclusively on this honeydew. But they don't have a monopoly on the honeydew. If any of you are familiar with pine honey, you may know that it comes from originally from the secretion of insects on pine. So it will be things like aphids and scale bugs, and particularly the pine worker insect, which sucks the sap of the pine, and that's in order to get enough sort of nutrients to survive, they have to drink an awful lot of it. Most of it passes straight through them because the sugar and the water are not much use to them. And then this falls onto leaves. Or is harvested directly by, in the case of the sites in the UK that I work on, wood ants, but it can also be harvested by bees. And that's how we end up with pine honey, which is very common in areas where there's relatively few flowering plants, but we have a lot of coniferous plants. In addition to this, another unifying feature that the wood ants have is their nest structure. This is actually quite a small nest, but I've chosen this photo because it's a nice close-up one. It illustrates this structure quite nicely. Some of the nests can get up to 2 meters across, and I've seen them nearly 2 meters high in some of the sites. So there's really old sites where they've been occupying for a very long time. And basically, it has a below-ground component and an above-ground component. They're excavating mineral soil, they're bringing it up onto the surface, and they're mixing it with organic matter. And then they do this really fascinating thing, which is essentially thatching their mounds. They take pine needles, it can be grass, it can be leaves. Because we tend to find them in coniferous forests, it's often needles, but they are not that fussy about what they use. And they create this sort of shell of organic matter over the top. And this helps to regulate the conditions inside the nest. It has very stable sort of moisture content, very stable pH, very stable temperature. And it sort of helps to remove the rain. And it makes it really easy to tell when a wood ant's nest is doing well and active and has ants in it and not abandoned, because they actively maintain this. If the thatch starts to look a bit shabby, you know the ants have gone somewhere else and they founded a new colony elsewhere because they didn't like this nest anymore, because it started to decompose. So they're constantly piling this on and maintaining it, and just as you would a thatched home, I suppose. But these nests aren't just home to the wood ants. Wood ants bring with them a whole array of what we call myrmecophiles, which is the word we use for organisms which are strongly associated with ants or found nowhere else other than ants' nests. And one of my favorite myrmecophiles is this tiny ant here, with next to a wood ant for scale. This is the shining guest ant, Formicoxenus nitidulus, and it makes its nests inside the twigs which form the nest of the wood ants. So you may see a particularly large twig that's been incorporated into the nest, and their entire colony of up to 40, 50 individuals will live inside one of these twigs, and they're never found anywhere else apart from on wood ants' nests or on wood ants' trails migrating between nests. And I think of these as sort of analogous to pigeons in human cities. You have these little harmless organisms which are eating the crumbs and sort of getting under their feet, but they're not parasitic. They're not doing any active harm. They're not like some organisms which will eat ant larvae or things like that. They're really just avoiding, they've managed to avoid being excluded by the wood ants, being eaten by the wood ants, and they just live in the structure of the nest and use it for protection and a stable environment. So wood ants do bring with them their own biodiversity as well. In addition to this, they can also have a massive effect on pests and pest species, as well as their sort of positive effects on the diversity of other invertebrates in their nest. So these are sometimes known as green oases. In this case, they're not green, they're grey because the photo is black and white, but hopefully it illustrates the point well enough. And this has been observed in forests where you have areas of high wood ant density and there's a pest outbreak. You can see at the edge here, where I'm just moving my mouse, the trees have been defoliated. All the leaves have been removed by a pest outbreak here. But in the center where there's wood ants' nests, we're getting this green oasis where they're eating the pests faster than they can reproduce. So actually suppressing the pest levels, which means the trees are able to survive. They're not losing the leaves so fast that that they can't replace them. And this picture on the right here really illustrates it beautifully. This was in Finland, and they took canopy cover photos of areas during a nun moth outbreak, areas in plantation forest where the wood ants, Formica polyctina, this is a wood ant that's found in Scandinavia and Central Europe, were present and where they were absent. And on the left is where they were present, and you can see there's much more shade, far fewer of the leaves have been eaten. And on the right here, we're looking at sort of bare twigs for the most part. So they can have a really massive effect on pest species, particularly in plantation forests where a lot of the natural predators are not present. I want to go back briefly to this nest structure, because this is the sort of foundation of a lot of the stuff I work on, and it is really fascinating. This is a much larger example than the example I showed you earlier on. This one's about 1 meter across, and you can see this beautiful thatch here nestled in the heather. And because they are building these nests out of organic material, these pine needles, this represents quite a big input of material from the surrounding forest into a central area. And the same could be said for the honeydew. All of this honeydew from the aphids is being taken from the canopies, from the canopy of the trees, and into the nest directly. So this represents a big input of carbohydrates, and in the nest material as well, we're getting nitrates, nitrogen and phosphorus as well, and also invertebrate prey. So I mentioned that the adults will only need the sugary carbohydrates to keep themselves going, but the growing larvae need a lot of protein, and this for wood ants comes from insect prey rather than pollen, as we get in bees. What this means is they're sort of taking loads and loads of invertebrates from the surrounding area, and they can actually really suppress the numbers of other invertebrates in the area, as we saw from the example with the pests. And bringing all of those nutrients, all of that protein containing lots of nitrogen and phosphorus and other trace nutrients into the nest, where it will eventually decay once it's been digested and so on. So that means that these can actually serve as essentially hotspots of nutrients, and this has been pretty well documented in the literature. People have studied wood ants' nests, and they found that they are elevated in a lot of important plant available nutrients compared to the surrounding soil. So by having these hotspots of nutrients, we're actually increasing the spatial heterogeneity of these nutrient resources in the soil, rather than it being a uniform or fairly uniform landscape of nutrients found at the same concentration in most places. We're getting these hotspots in some areas where there's lots of nutrients and other areas where there's a sort of normal amount. And this has the potential to be really beneficial for plant species. And this is something that's not been extensively studied yet. If I get time, maybe it's something I'll look into. But essentially, you can then have more facility for more sort of nutrient rich plants with rich nutrient requirements to be able to make a crust on the edge of these wood ant nests, where they would not otherwise be able to do in some soils. And spatial heterogeneity is generally considered to be a good thing in ecosystems. That it adds that extra complexity, means there's more different niches for different species, and it can help promote biodiversity. And biodiversity in itself, in say plantation forests, which I work in, can also have beneficial effects on pest abundance and all kinds of things like that. So complexity generally is considered good in ecosystems. But one question that puzzled me when I first started learning about this is how do they affect the non-nest soils? We're concentrating all of these resources into a very, very small area, but all of those resources have to come from somewhere, and where they're coming from is the surrounding soil, the non-nest soils. And so I wanted to investigate how this resource removal affected the soil away from the nest. But before I explain more about that, I feel like I should introduce the specific population I work on, because there's a bit of history behind this population. I work on Formica lugubris in the North York moors. And I mostly work on them in plantation forests. They are really abundant there. The nest density is quite astonishing in some areas. And they would have originally come from ancient forest refugia, these areas which wouldn't have been deforested, and where the wood ants sort of survived when most of this area was sort of open moorland. In the last 100 years, as people have been planting more trees for timber and growing plantation forests and reforestation, they've managed to expand into these plantation forests and utilize the trees and the forests there. I made that sound like a really dramatic, rapid expansion. It wasn't. They are very, very slow dispersers in this country, up to as little as 50 meters a year in some parts. And the reason for this is the UK populations of Formica lugubris are what we call polydomous. Now, on the continent, where you find Formica lugubris as well, they are different. They're more like, I hesitate to say the word normal ants because there's a huge diversity of different behaviors within ants, but more how I described earlier on, where a single queen flies off, mates, and then finds a new place to found a nest. In fact, they do it by something called temporary social parasitism, where they actually go into the nest of a related species, sneak past the workers, kill the queen, and start laying their own eggs there. So that's one system of founding new nests. But the UK ones are a bit weird, and no one's really sure why. But they do this thing called budding, where they will basically fly out, mate, return to the nest, and then, much as bees would when they swarm, a whole collection of workers will join the queen on foot rather than by flying, because the workers are flightless, to found a nest very nearby. And what this means is we end up with these networks of nests, which are all connected by trails. They're all very, very closely related, and it really blurs the definition of what's a colony and what's a nest. So we have to be very specific about what we're talking about with these wood ants, because generally we can use the word colony and nest more or less interchangeably. But with wood ants, that's simply not, well, with Formica lugubris in the UK anyway, that's simply not possible, because the same ants might turn up in this nest one day or this nest another day, and they're moving along these trails. They're sharing brood, they're sharing food, and they're sharing the workers as well between these. So the colony is this whole network, but the nests are these individual structures. But this is the reason why they're moving through the forest so slowly, essentially, is because of this polydomy, because they're reproducing by budding rather than by nuptial flights. Well, they have a nuptial flight to mate, but they don't then found a colony after that immediately. It means they have to disperse on foot, which takes forever. And they have to also stay in touch with the other nests in the network. So they don't colonize new areas very quickly. We do have really good data at this site as well. I mentioned there's a bit of history to this site. This is just one of the sites I work on in the North York Moors, but I think it illustrates the point really nicely. This area that's shaded in purple, I'm sorry, I should point with a mouse, not with my finger. This area that's shaded in purple is ancient woodland. So this would have been the areas where the forests, where the wood ants were present when all of this was open moorland here. And the earliest data we have for this population was collected in 2011 by an early researcher in the lab I'm working in at the moment, called Duncan Proctor, and he found that they had spread way beyond the margins of the ancient woodland, and they were found all over in this plantation forest that had been planted in the last 100 years. And we've been back there and collected data over the years since 2011. So we've been able to map the gradual expansion of the wood ants along out away from the original source population. And our most recent data is from 2022. But as you can see, quite a lot of work has gone into compiling this data set. And this really gives us a great opportunity to study the effects that wood ants have on an ecosystem. And I'm particularly interested in the soil, but we've also looked at how they affect, for example, invertebrates and other insects in these areas. But the reason why this is so useful for studying this is it's basically a found experiment. We have an inbuilt control because we have areas where the wood ants have been present for a long time, this long-term wood ant occupancy, areas where they've recently arrived, and areas where they're absent, but all in plantation forest. That's the same species. We can know exactly how old the forest is, so we can control for age. And so we can compare really similar forest with just the presence or absence of wood ants. And we can even look at how long the wood ants has been there affects the things that they're affecting, in my case, the soil processes that I'm interested in. And because there are wood ants found all over these plantation sites in the North York Moors, we're actually able to replicate this 8 times. So we have sites, this 3-way sort of comparison between our control or absent control, where they've recently arrived and where they've been for ages. We're able to do that 8 times, which is great. I mean, it's a really difficult to get that many replicates in a lot of systems like this. So what we did was we took 240 soil samples from all of these different areas, and we analyzed them for bulk density, which is essentially the weight per unit volume of the soil once you've dried it out, and is a good indicator of the amount of organic matter in there, because mineral soil is much heavier, and lots of sands and clays make things heavier than organic matter. We also measured the soil pH, so how acidic the soil was. and the concentrations of nitrate, nitrite, and phosphate. And the reason why we're interested in these nutrients is because these are the ones that are most available to plants. These are soluble, and the plants can absorb them really easily. So if they're affecting these, we can infer that they might be having an effect on other members of the ecosystem, other plants, and so on. And we also looked at total carbon and total nitrogen, which is another indicator of organic matter, and is important for nutrient cycling in itself. Excuse me. And we took all of these samples from the non-nest soils. So here we're comparing the soil away from the nest to the soil where there is no wood ants presence at all, as opposed to just comparing nest soils to non-nest soils. But we did do that as well, just to confirm that these wood ants here are doing the same as we've seen in the literature. They're also elevating the nutrients in their nests, as other people have seen in the past. And I'm pleased to report that they did. They were behaving themselves. So bulk density was much lower in the wood ant's nest because of this incorporation of organic matter, which is hardly a surprise. And likewise, total carbon, total nitrogen were in much higher concentrations in the nests compared to control soils. And nitrate was a little complicated. Nitrate and nitrite were a little complicated, and so was pH, but phosphate at least was at much higher concentrations in the wood ant's nest. So far so good. But when we went to compare the non-nest soils with and without wood ant presence, things were a little less exciting initially. What I really want you to take from this graph, there's no point dwelling on it too long. What this shows is that not very much is going on here. So this is for percentage carbon here, but I've split them down by site, and we can see that the sites are very different from one another. But our treatments here, so where they're absent, where they've recently arrived, and where they've been for ages, it's hard to tell them apart. And there's no real statistical significance to any difference between the treatments here. And there's a similar pattern for total nitrogen, nitrate, and phosphate, pH, and bulk density. Doesn't seem like wood ant presence in the non-nest soils is having an effect. But where things got really interesting was when we looked at nitrite. So nitrite is very short-lived in soils. It rapidly gets turned into nitrate. It sort of sits as an intermediate in the nitrogen cycle. And whilst it is available to some organisms, mostly fungi and bacteria, nitrate is the main sort of plant, is the end product. It's the main plant available nutrient. So the rates of turnover of nitrite are really fast in forest soils. There's a lot going on. And what we see here is that where the wood ants are present, the concentrations of nitrite are really low in forest soils. Occasionally you get sort of an outlier, but mostly it's really, really low concentration of nitrite in soils where the wood ants have been present for a long time. It seems to be a bit site dependent where the wood ants have more recently arrived, but much higher where the wood ants are absent. So there seems to be something going on here. The wood ants are affecting nitrite in this way, and it's quite a big effect size as well. So this scale here is actually, it's a logarithmic scale. So every 1 unit of increase actually represents a 10-fold increase. It just makes it easier to plot all on the same thing if you use a logarithmic scale. So whatever's happening, it's quite a big effect. So to summarize that little bit then, it seems like, yep, we're seeing our local effects of Formica lugubris on soil in the nest structure itself. That's great. And nitrite was decreased in our non-nest soils. Now, in terms of mechanisms and why this might be, why are wood ants having, well, firstly, this local effect, and this is because of we think because of the removal of resources, particularly our organic matter. So we've got this wood ant here carrying a little, I think that's the birch catkin, but all the needles and that kind of thing, building the nests. That's going to massively increase the amount of total carbon, total nitrogen in the soil. But explaining the nitrite in the non-nest soils is a little more difficult, especially as we didn't see a difference in nitrate or phosphate. So it's not necessarily directly because they're removing resources from the soil. And really, we have to think about the nitrogen cycle in this. So nitrite, as I mentioned, is sort of an intermediate nutrient between ammonium and nitrate. But the important take home here is that it is downstream of decomposition. Some decomposition has to happen before you get nitrate in a soil. And then that nitrite is rapidly converted into nitrate. So possibly the wood ants are somehow downregulating decomposition. They're reducing the rate at which decomposition is occurring. And there is a potential mechanism here if we think about their role as predators. So I mentioned they're taking huge amounts of insect prey from both the trees, but also from the ground, sort of terrestrial invertebrates, to feed to their brood, their young. And many of these invertebrates may well be detritivores. They're feeding on this organic matter in the soil. Now, they're not decomposers directly, but what they're doing by feeding on the organic matter in the soil is they're breaking it down, they're sort of processing it and making it much more available to microbial processes. And this actual decomposition that results in ammonium is done by aerobic and anaerobic sort of bacteria and fungi. And if you break this stuff down and give them more surface area to work on, this is going to happen faster. So perhaps by suppressing the soil invertebrates here, the wood ants are actually regulating decomposition. They're slowing the rate of decomposition, meaning that organic matter stays in the soil for longer, and we get lower rates of the production of ammonium and eventually nitrite. And then the end product, nitrate, we didn't see a difference there, but that's possibly because nitrate isn't limiting in these soils. So these soils are highly acidic, and they really only have a very low species diversity in them, not very many herbaceous plants, like fast-growing herbaceous plants, because there's a lot of closed canopy plantation. So it could just be the nitrate is kind of hanging around in the soil as an end product until the trees absorb it, which might explain why that was accumulating and not really affected, but the nitrite was so low. So I've talked mostly about really very direct effects here so far. But I mentioned that these nests are acting as hotspots of certain nutrients. And this can have really interesting impacts on the spatial heterogeneity, as I mentioned earlier on. So by that, I mean the complexity, basically how patchy resources are in the soil. And we do actually have the data here to study spatial variation or spatial heterogeneity in these resources, because we can take our data sets and essentially use them to generate distributions, basically a larger data set that's sort of simulated from the real data that has all the same properties of the data, has the same mean, it has the same sort of standard deviation, has the same skew. So it's similar to the data in every way, but we've generated it using those parameters in a computer, and we create these distributions. And this can allow us to study spatial variation in a sort of indirect way by creating essentially compound simulated landscapes. So we can combine, for example, our data set from the non-nest soils where the wood ants were present with our data set, our simulated data set from the nests themselves, and we can introduce the nest data at a frequency that is dependent on the density of the nests in the real environment. So we're essentially creating a full landscape complete with wood ants nests, entirely simulated, based on this data. And we can compare that to when the nests are absent. So we can compare just the raw non-nest data with when we include the nests and see how that affects the variability. And we can also compare this to where the wood ants were absent, our simulated data set for where they're absent. And basically we can do a bit of maths and get a number out the end, which tells us how variable each of these scenarios are. And what we found when we did this was that actually there was almost no difference between our simulated occupied without the nests. So essentially where we had just simulated the non-nest data to create this distribution. There was no difference between that and when we included the nests. Now, probably the reason for this is the density of the nests is quite low. So we were simulating this data over sort of kilometer squares, and we had a mean nest density of approximately, a nest size of approximately 1 meter. So we divided it into 1 million squares, we divided it into 1 million squares, and then we added the nests at the rate of that. But if we're getting maybe 20 nests per kilometer, then 20 in 1 million is really a drop in the ocean. So it seems like that's not enough to actually drive the spatial heterogeneity. But we did see a difference between these two, where the wood ants were present, and where they were absent. So this suggests that there is some spatial variability being driven by the ants, but it's not driven by the nest soils. It's actually being driven by the non-nest soils. So total carbon and total nitrogen, and to a lesser extent pH, were more variable. There was a greater sort of spread of data where the wood ants were present. But we had the opposite effect for nitrate and phosphate, where the wood ants seemed to be causing there to be less variability in the data when they were present. The absent treatment, the simulated absent data, showed more variability. As I've already mentioned, the reason for the sort of being driven by the nest soils could potentially be because the nests are just too small and sparse to really have an effect. But it's a little harder to explain this effect of total carbon, total nitrogen until we consider organic matter. So I mentioned they're taking leaf litter from areas around, and there's been some work that showed that the organic layer is actually thinner for about 8 meters around these wood ants' nest. So by removing all of this leaf litter and building their nests, potentially they're creating a sort of shadow around the nest, which is depleted in total carbon and total nitrogen. Now, on the grand scale, this won't show up, which is why we didn't find any difference between the non-nest soils when we were just comparing non-nest soils to the absent soils in terms of the difference of means, at least. But when we compare the variability, it means if we're sampling within this shadow, we're more likely to get an extremely low value. Compared to outside, it will get a high value, so we end up getting more of a spread. Nitrate and phosphate, as I mentioned, was going in the opposite direction here. And there's potentially an explanation for this as well. If we think about the kind of things that are going to be inputting lots of nitrate and phosphate into the organisms, part of it's going to be what we call necromass, which is basically dead stuff. Now, a lot of dead stuff is going to be a protein source for the ants, dead invertebrates, even small. I've seen them collecting protein, collecting food from dead rabbits in the past in nests. They're really not fussy. If it's got protein in it, they'll take it back to their nest and they'll feed it to the brood. So potentially where the wood ants are present, they're sort of hoovering up all of these hotspots of nutrients before they have a chance to decompose by taking this protein back to the nest. And so maybe that's why we're seeing less variability in nitrate and phosphate when the wood ants are present, because they're actually essentially removing some of these hotspots, which would be left alone where the wood ants are absent. Now, there is another potential explanation, and it could be this one, it could be either of these, or it could be a combination of the two. But this one actually involves their competitive interactions with birds. So there's been work that's shown that tree creepers will spend less time foraging on trees where wood ants are present. And the reason why this is because the wood ants reduce the abundance of other invertebrates. The tree creepers do not eat wood ants themselves. Very few things will eat wood ants, apart from woodpeckers. Some woodpeckers will use them as a food resource. But that's pretty much it. They're quite unique in that regard. But both Paris tits and tree creepers have been shown to have a lower abundance in areas where the wood ants are present and spend less time foraging there. And in fact, one study found in the presence of a super colony, bird diversity and abundance was lower across loads of different species. And the reason for this, as I mentioned, was competition for invertebrate resources. Insectivores aren't going to hang around if there's another thing hoovering up all of the invertebrates. But less time spent foraging means basically less chance of defecation in the area. This is another great source of nitrate and phosphate into soils. And this sort of handy little splat is going to create a small patch of nutrients there, which may well then come along and be sampled by me with my soil corer, which you will end up with less of when the wood ants are present because they're excluding these birds essentially. So whichever mechanism it is, or if it's a combination of the two, it does seem like wood ants are driving heterogeneity of different resources at different scales. The high quality resources, like our sort of protein resources, they seem to be reducing the heterogeneity of where they're present. And the low quality resources are sort of carbon and nitrogen, organic matter. They seem to actually be increasing the spatial heterogeneity of it. But this can actually have some structural effects because they are absent from the forest interiors. They're not present everywhere in these forests, which means you can have a sort of greater landscape level of heterogeneity. I've done this diagram to sort of illustrate this point. If we imagine our total carbon and our nitrogen, our organic matter essentially, in blue as being fairly uniform in these forests because leaf litter is ubiquitous. And all of these little dots here are are our sort of hotspots of nitrate and phosphate, are high quality nutrients. If we add ants' nests in here, we've got these shadows around the nests, but because they're not occupying the whole area, there's going to be an area where they're foraging, reducing the complexity, reducing the variability of these little hotspots of high quality resources, but leaving it be elsewhere where they're not foraging. So this creates more structure in the environment. But this does beg the question, why are they absent from some areas? Well, that's been something that I've been working on more recently, because as we can see, these long rides here, these roads and stuff, seem to be where most of the nests are. And they're favoring the canopy gaps. These are actually edge specialists, and they need the sunlight and the resources of the trees here. And I've worked a little bit on the different properties of these rides and how they can affect the abundance of ants. Because in these plantation forests, all of these canopy gaps that they're colonizing along are as a result of management by foresters. We decide where we put these lovely straight lines that humans are so fond of, and these edges when we fell the trees, and that can have an effect. It have an edge effect, which can affect all kinds of species, and it is also increasing this heterogeneity again. It's creating these patches of sun inside the forest. And as I mentioned, Formica lugubris are edge specialists because they require these resources from the trees in form of aphid honeydew, and also they need direct sunlight to regulate the temperature in their nest in order to keep their brood warm and allow them to develop. And they'll abandon nests where it's too shady. Now, there's a lot of factors that can affect how much shade there's going to be in these canopy gaps. Things like the width of a ride or footpath or road or firebreak, or the height of the trees. But the one I really want to focus on is the bearing of the ride, the direction it is relative to north. Because this can have an effect on both the sort of spatial variability in the amount of sun there is and the temporal variability in the amount of sun there is. So we've got these east-west rides here, we've got some north-south ones, and all different compass bearings here running along. And these provide the edges that the wood ants require. And if we imagine our sort of idealized rides here at nice right angles, obviously never quite the way that it is in the field, a ride running east-west is going to have loads of shade on the south side. So it's basically going to be useless to the wood ants. They're not going to be able to build nests there. But the north side of that ride is going to get a full day of sun in the northern hemisphere. Whereas a ride that's running north-south is going to receive about half a day's sunshine on each side. So potentially they can utilize that, but to a lesser extent, because less sunlight is less favorable to them. And so they might not achieve the population growth and densities that we'd expect. And then this intermediate one, here are intercardinal points like northwest and southeast here. It's sort of the worst of both worlds, potentially, because we're getting shade on the south side from the south. We're still getting nearly a full day of shade there, but the north side is also starting to receive shade at some points in the day. So maybe we'd expect lower ant densities to be there, something sort of like this. Now, it's not just ant density that we're interested in. We did find that this was the case. Our ant densities were lower on these intercardinal rides than on the east-west ones. And we found a pretty similar ant density, ant population density on east-west rides and north-south rides. So something like this is really favorable here, this long one running east-west and this north-south one. This one less favorable though. But one of the things we're most interested in, given the beneficial effects of wood ants in these plantation forests, is how rapidly they're dispersing. So not just how many we're finding, but how are they getting to these new bits of forest? This is the rate that the population margin has changed per year. So this is the rate of the population growth as they're expanding along these rides. I've color-coded this just to make it easier to read, but essentially the intercardinal points, things like northwest and southwest and northeast and so on, did see less growth in the population margins than what I referred to as cardinal rides, so ones running east-west or north-south. This is in meters per year. So as you can see, it's still quite a slow growth. The most we saw was 60 meters per year, and some of them actually shrunk. The margins retracted because the conditions have become less favorable. But in general, what this means is that the bearing can be really important for the wood ant abundance in these forests of canopy gaps and rides. And in terms of nest abundance as well, what side of the ride you're looking at matters as well, although that's less important from the point of view of forestry. As I said, we did find more abundance on north, south, and east, west rides, but we also found increased margins growth on these east, west, and north, south rides compared to these northwest ones. Now, I've mentioned sort of some of the advantages of wood ants, and essentially, if you want to manage your land to encourage wood ants, and you're having a plantation forest of Norway spruce or something like that, this seems to suggest that if you, when you're at the planning stage, if you cut fire breaks or paths or roads, particularly fire breaks, I mean, forest managers have complete control over where they cut those. If you cut them in east-west orientations and north-south orientations to maintain kind of connectivity between the rides, you will see the wood ants spread much faster through them than if they're all sort of at, say, 45-degree angles, for example, which can be really potentially beneficial, especially when we consider the effects that they can have on pests, referring to these photos before. So then to summarize, I'm aware I'm running rapidly short of time. I hope that's given people an idea of the sort of interaction between wood ants and the forests there, and a bit of a background in wood ants and why I'm so interested, because they have this potential to modify the soil, affect invertebrate pests, and host biodiversity, and this can feed back into the forests, but at the same time, the way the forests are managed and the traits of the forest are affecting them by provisioning them with food, giving them habitats, and the way that they're laid out and managed can affect their abundance and their population growth. So thank you very much for listening to that. I hope you found that interesting. If there's time for questions at the end, I'll be more than happy to answer them. I'm aware I overran very slightly, so if people need to dash off, I'm sure that's fine. But yeah, if there's any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jacob. That was really interesting. I had no idea some of the complexities that you know, that you have to deal with. So please, people, ask your questions via the chat, and we can put those to Jacob. I mean, you mentioned at one point the aerial mating. Is that very similar to Hymenoptera? Is it, you know, do they have drone congregation areas and that sort of thing?
Well, I will confess to not being a bee expert. I have worked on wasps and I've worked on orchid bees in the past, but they are largely solitary, so they don't really count. But as I understand it, it's very similar to throughout the Hymenoptera. They all have sort of nuptial flights. If you live in a big colony like that and you're producing all of your reproductives in one go, essentially, which at least ants do. I'm not sure if that's the case with bees necessarily. You may have to enlighten me on that one. But it pays to sort of synchronize these things so that all of the reproductives are meeting in sort of one go, not just for the purpose of evading predators. We all know Flying Ant Day when the seagulls are having an absolute feeding frenzy in the skies above us, but also for the purposes of finding a mate. It makes it easier if everybody's flying at the same time. Yes. So yeah, certainly in ants you do get aggregations of them, but I would say it's more an aggregation in space because ants are so abundant. The whole region in which the conditions are suitable for nuptial flight will have a high density of ants of that species for the time that's there.
Okay. I also had a question on the anatomy aspects. Because, you know, Hymenoptera, you know, we have the well, the sort of bees and wasps. We have 3 distinct body parts, and yet on ants there seem to be 4, 5, 6 sort of. Yeah,
it's weird. The terminology between the different, even within the Hymenoptera, for the different body parts it seems to be different in each group. So in wasps, I think it's fairly standard to say the head, the thorax, and the abdomen. But then in certain bees, is it mesosoma and metastoma? I can't remember how they divide it, because
honeybees basically still have the same 3. Yes.
Yeah. Basically, it's to do with the segmentation. Now, ants, we do still split it into 3. We'll say the gaster and the thorax here. It does look like there's an extra segment in there, but it's just sort of the shape of the thorax. Right. It's still where all the legs are going. With that, it's important to remember that, I mean, all insects are descended from much more sort of primitively segmented things. So the body parts are just clusters of segments, and how they choose to distribute those segments will vary group to group. I'm more of an ecologist rather than an anatomist, but I've done a fair bit of, most of the anatomy I've done is on orchid bees, but so I'm more familiar with their anatomy than ants, ironically. But yeah, it does seem that there's a different word for everything for the different Hymenoptera.
Right. I have a question here from James Brownhill. He said, you mentioned the two parts of the nest, above ground and below. What's the proportion of each, and is there any difference in the internal structure of the nest?
So in wood ants, the proportion is pretty equal, actually. So essentially, they're excavating the mineral soil beneath them, piling it up on top and mixing it with organic matter. They're also incorporating organic matter below. So you can sort of imagine in cross-section, this nest is almost lens-shaped. It's sort of symmetrical above and below ground. There isn't that much difference in structure. However, there is a difference in the way it's used. So they will move brood around depending on the temperature. So sometimes you will actually see brood on the surface of the mound. They've brought them up to sort of bask in the sun, and then they'll return them down to the brood chambers. But on cold days, they'll take the brood right down to the very deepest part where the temperature is more stable, so they don't get cold shocked in the sort of more exposed upper part of the mound. And they can do some really interesting. I mean, they're really good at regulating the temperature in the nests. As I understand it, bees will use their flight muscles to kind of generate some sort of heat inside the hive. Unfortunately, ants don't have flight muscles, so they have to sort of circumvent that by, they will take loads and loads of workers will come out onto the surface, and we tend to call it piling or swarming on a sunny day, and basically they will bask. And they're, rather than transporting food or nest materials down into the nest, all they're doing is transporting heat. So they will sit on the nest for a little while, sunbathe. When they're warm, they will go down into the nest, into the brood chambers, and re-radiate that heat into the colony. And so it's a really clever sort of behavioral mechanism of keeping the temperature nice and stable for rearing their brood.
And what happens during the winter then, Jacob?
So they will hibernate during the winter, or we tend to call it diapause. But basically, I imagine similar to bees as well, their activity will drop right off. So no field work for me at the moment. But around sort of September time, they start to wind things down. It's when they will produce reproductives mostly. It's why we tend to see reproductives in the autumn. And there will be a final brood of workers that will overwinter. And they won't keep brood during the winter. And they will just slow their processes right down. They will go deep into the soil where things are more stable temperature-wise, and sort of sit it out. And then in spring, they will re-emerge, maintain the thatch on the outside of the nest, and start gathering resources. It can cause problems sometimes, because there can be a bit of a mismatch between when the aphids arrive and when it's warm enough for the ants to get active. So early on, they're often very hungry, and they need to find the trees that have the aphids in them fast to get the nutrients that they need.
Pat asks, do the wood ants benefit from those mini ants that live in the twigs? Will they just tolerate them?
As far as we know, there is no benefit, but there's also no real cost to them. They're really hard to study because they are never found outside of the nest. There's actually some work going on to look at their population genetics at the moment to see how related they are, because we just know almost nothing about them. We have no idea how they disperse. You usually only see them occasionally on the surface of the mounds, and if you're quick, you can get one to photograph it or something, or collect it for a sample. But we know very little about them. But as far as we can tell, they are completely not detrimental to the wood ants at all. But neither is it a mutualism. The wood ants don't benefit from their presence. There are some myrmecophiles, though, that are more parasitic. I know of the large blue butterfly is one that is found in, I think it's Lasius flavus nests, the meadow ant, and that will actually eat brood items. And there's a beetle, I forget its name off the top of my head, that lives in wood ants nests that will do the same thing. So there are some parasitic relationships, but not with the shining guest ant.
Right. Alan Hepper says, thank you, very well set out and presented, so thank you. Some questions. Are the individual nests only led by one queen? How long do the queens live? And the very large nests,
Hmm.
are they effectively inherited through supersedure, or are they abandoned and reoccupied? Oh,
Um, yeah, well, the sort of the short answer to that question is all of the above, because for example, Formica lugubris, I mentioned they did this temporary social parasitism where they, in the continent at least, they will fly off, the queens will, they will mate, and then they will find the nests of another kind of ant called Formica sanguinea. It's the blood red ant, and they will go in there, they will kill the queen, lay their eggs, and in that case, it's one queen initially. But what can happen in these polydomous networks is you have multiple queens present at the same time because they're returning to the nest. They fly out, they'll mate, they'll return to the nest, and they won't necessarily leave immediately. They might not leave ever. So this is called polygyny, where you have multiple queens laying, very closely related in these nests. So you can have both a single queen and multiple queens. And I'm dreadfully sorry, I've forgotten the second part of the question.
how long do the queens live?
How long do the queens live? Yes, so it can be up to 5 years. We're not 100% sure, but it's a number of years. They're not just a single season. 5 to 10 years is thought to be roughly the age.
Wow.
So you'll have this overlapping of queens. But in answer to your question about do they get abandoned and reoccupied, this will also happen as well. So in these polydomous networks, there might be a nest that's founded. They'll realize it's not doing too well this year. And so all the workers and the queens will leave and go back to the original nest or found another nest elsewhere. But if conditions become more favorable, they will reoccupy that nest. You can have nests that are massive, but only a very small part of it is actually being maintained because it was really, really big. Then it got too shaded. They all abandoned it and then they returned and have only been occupying a very small amount of it because it's still not a very suitable nest.
Okay. Archie asks, do ants store honeydew in the nest or share and consume it straight away?
They consume it straight away, but they can share it through trophallaxis, so they'll regurgitate it. But basically, the honeydew is stored inside their bodies. They're not fortunate enough to have larders like bees do. They can't store it in a stable way outside of their bodies. So it is actually all just stored in either fat. Over the winter, it'll be stored as fat or fat reserves and so on. But in the summer, it's more likely to be stored just in their crop to feed to other ants.
All right. Joe asks, how can managers of coniferous forestry reduce damage to wood ant nests during harvesting operations?
That's a very good question. Well, actually, I've done a fair bit of work. I mean, all of this work's been on Forestry Commission land, and the Forestry Commission are really on board with preserving the land. The ants, they ask for updated data of where they are every year, so they can sort of factor it into their planning decisions. But one of the things that forest managers can do when felling forests that will help preserve the ants is, I'm just going to go back to one of my slides because I think it illustrates it very well. Yes, so if you can see, am I still sharing the screen? I am, aren't I?
You are actually, yes.
So in this area here on the left, you can see there's like these strips running through. Now, I mentioned fire breaks, they're an important part of forests, but these aren't actually fire breaks. What they've done is they've strip felled it. So rather than cutting down all of the forest at once, they've cut 10-meter strips out of the forest every 10 meters, which means that it's not a completely bare patch. So what this means is they've taken out half the timber and they can come back and get the other half of the timber later once those patches have grown up. But this kind of row thinning is really beneficial for the wood ants because it does introduce some sunlight in there, but it doesn't deprive them of their food resource. Whereas if it's completely clear felled, the population will just collapse. They'll just have to go elsewhere. They'll either, the ones that are near other trees, they'll migrate to other parts of the forest and return there, or they'll just simply die. But in terms of damage to the actual nest structure, the wood ants are really good at reorganizing themselves. There's been some work on translocating wood ants nests, where basically you dig up the nest and put it in Hessian sacks and move them, and you put them in the new place. And the success rate is not 100% by any stretch of the imagination. It takes a long time to know if it's been successful, but they're very good at reorganizing themselves and getting things together again. So in terms of actual disturbance, the amount of sunlight and the amount of food they've got is far more important.
Yes. Okay. I will kill your screen.
Okay.
Yeah. I think James Brownhill must know something about ants. He says the narrow-headed ant is very rare in the UK. What methods can be used to encourage them to spread and build more nests, or use human intervention methods to create a wider spread?
Yeah, this is a really good question. I've not studied the narrow-headed ant very much itself, although they are in the genus Formica. They're not considered true wood ants by a lot of people. They don't have quite the same sort of nesting structure and behavior. And they are restricted to a very few sites in the UK. And no one's really sure the reason exactly for their decline, apart from simply habitat loss. I'm afraid I can't answer the question, though. I don't know very much about that species of ant particularly. It comes up in meetings occasionally when people are talking about other Formica species, but it's not an area that I'm an expert in. So I'm sorry, I can't answer your question.
It makes me think of a question I had, which was regarding the spread. You said that this this species is found I can't remember the word, but all the way around.
Circumpolar, yeah, right around the poles.
Yeah, that's and of course, honeybees are as well, but they only did that with human help. So they were never in the Americas, for example, or Australia, or
So in this case, it's not a single species, but it's a group of species. Right. So Formica lugubris is found from sort of the UK and Western Europe all the way into sort of Siberia, but then Polyctena is found from sort of Eastern Europe all the way around to the far end of Siberia, and then the species in North America are completely different. They have the same sort of behaviors, and they are in the same genus. They're very closely related, but they are recognized as completely different species, and they are native there. To my knowledge, wood ants are not invasive anywhere.
Right. Talking about invasive, Thomas Bickerdike asks, are there any invasive species on the horizon that may arrive or already here that may cause problems? Perhaps he means to the ants. I think, we have invasive species that are worrying us in terms of honeybees.
It's another really good question that I'm afraid I don't know the answer to. I think probably not. However, the reason why I think that is because very few things eat ants and they have very little competition. The niche that they occupy is actually quite unique. So any competition is going to be from other wood ants. There are lots of invasive ant species, like for example, the Argentine ant, which is not in the UK yet, but other ones like the Pharaoh ant and things like that do really, really well in invasive ranges. And they have a really bad record of outcompeting native ants in their invasive range. However, the niche that wood ants occupy is very, very specific. They're quite specialized. They have pretty much one source of carbohydrate, and they're very tolerant of overwintering and things like that, which a lot of the invasive ants we're used to talking about are from the tropics. As there's no real invasive species of wood ant or anything that's sort of equivalent there, I don't think that there's any invasive species. The main threats to wood ants in this country are definitely habitat loss. Habitat loss pretty much exclusively.
Okay, well, I think as time is sort of getting on quite a lot, and I think we've run out of questions now. So thank you very much, Jacob. That was really fascinating stuff. And I'm sure that everyone who was listening will have certainly picked up quite a lot of knowledge. So thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Apologies for overrunning a little bit. I can't answer questions in short sentences, I'm afraid.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Thank you very much. Right. So yes, I saw a few people clapping. Thank you very much indeed. So thank you everyone for turning up this evening, and our next meeting, our next Zoom session, I'll give you some details on right now. So once more, thank you, Jacob, and I'll close with a few. Where are we? Here we go. That one. And there we go. So hopefully you are seeing what's coming up next, which is Alison McAfee from North Carolina State. And that's on the 13th of February. And she's going to be talking about some of the stressors which affect our bees, and with a particular reference to the drone. So the perilous life of a drone. So that will actually be the last of our Zoom meetings for this part of the year. But in March, we have our spring meeting. In-person meeting at Norton Priory Museum in Runcorn in Cheshire, and we're hoping that that location will be attractive to North Wales and to the Liverpool and Manchester areas. It's the 11th of March, and booking is open now from our website. There's a 10% discount. There's an early bird discount up until February the 11th, so it's £27. After that, it'll be 30. It's a full day meeting. It'll include a hot or cold lunch option with interval refreshments. And it looks a really interesting site to have a look around. We've got 4 speakers. Steve Martin is going to be talking about some of the work. This is a new talk that he's putting together. It's not one that you may have heard before. So Steve Martin's talking about some of the molecular methods that are now being applied to the DWV virus. Hannah is from London University, Queen Mary London, and she's going to be talking about the way in which one of the gut pathogens spreads in bumblebees, with consequences for the way that the same things happen in honeybees. Paul Crosses has an interesting one. He's been tracking honeybees over their entire foraging range using mechanical, electric drones that track them. So they are able to monitor what they're doing in real time and with very good accuracy. And then finally, Paul Crosses from Bangor. And finally, we've got Raquel de Souza, who's in Jerry Wright's bee lab at Oxford University, and she's going to be talking about honeybee nutrition, particularly their needs for the micronutrients in like minerals, the sodium, potassium, magnesium, and all of that sort of stuff. So that's what we've got lined up for Norton Priory. I do hope that some of you may be able to make that. Be a good day. And we're also thinking about an autumn conference. It's 2019, the last autumn conference that we held in Kenilworth. Unfortunately, the hotel there was a victim of the pandemic and has shut down. So we're looking for alternative venues. And there's a possibility of one in the Malvern Hills and one in Leamington Spa. We're looking at the 24th, 25th, 26th of November. And if we run it similarly to last time, there'll be a talk on the Friday night, 4 during Saturday, and then we'll finish at lunchtime on Sunday. So all of the details are on the website, www.cabk.org.uk, and membership is available there as well, and all sorts of other goodies. So do have a look at that, and hopefully we'll see you next time at on the 13th of February is the next thing, the perilous life of a drone. So thank you to everyone.